All rise. Veuillez vous lever. The International Residual Mechanism for Criminal Tribunals is now in session. L'audience du mécanisme international a appelé à exercer leurs fonctions résiduelles. The tribunal pénal est ouvert. Please be seated.
Good morning to everyone in and around the courtroom. Mr. Registrar, would you please call the case?
Thank you and good morning, Your Honours. This is case MICT-15-96-T. The prosecutor was Stanišić and Franco Simatović.
Thank you. And may we have the appearances, please?
Good morning, Mr. President and Your Honors. For the prosecution, I'm Douglas Stringer, appearing with Sarah Clanton, Grace Harbor, Tomalo Gel, and Alana Hofstad.
Good morning, Your Honours. For Mr. Stanišić, myself, Wayne Jordash, Katrina Murdoch, Ian Edwards, Ruby Axelson, Joe Holmes, Dusko Babic, Diana Machanovic, and Marilena Stegbauer.
Dobro jutro, časni sude. Dobro jutro svima u i oko sudnice. Za odbranu Simatović danas su prisutni Vladimir Petrović, Eva Jerman, Bartoš Leke Henshold, Melanie Vranješ i ja, Mihajlo Baktač. Hvala.
Thank you. Today we begin the opening, we approach the opening of the case for the accused Stanišić, and if there are no preliminary matters from either side, then I would invite Mr. Jordash to begin.
Understand the direction of travel. The first half of the opening will be concerning the flawed premises that this case is built on, and the second will outline in more detail what the defence evidence will be. There is little that is not alleged against Mr. Stanišić in the prosecution's voracious joint criminal enterprise. Not only did he command and deploy the Red Berets, Arkhan's Tigers and the Scorpions into ethnic cleansing operations throughout Croatia and Bosnia, but he was apparently Milosevic's main man, one of the main organisers, suppliers and controllers of the Croatian and Bosnian Serbian political and military machines. Few indictments have encompassed such a range of direct and indirect involvement in political, military and paramilitary activity. It is therefore important to examine from the outset the underlying premise of the prosecution case. It is important to note that the prosecution does not, in the main, accuse Mr. Stanišić of merely instigating or otherwise availing himself of the various direct perpetrators to commit crime. They go much further than that. As slide 1 shows, according to the prosecution, Stanišić commanded thousands of men within the political, military and paramilitary spheres. Mr. Stanisić's alleged command spans a dizzying array of military and civilian actors, including the VRS, the JNA, the TOs, the police forces, and of course his own 3 units. It is of course absurd, and the fragility of the evidence speaks eloquently to the absurdity of this premise. Despite this premise, they've chosen not to prosecute him for superior responsibility pursuant to Article 7.3. This contradiction at the heart of the prosecution case stands as a clear admission that the prosecution cannot prove that Mr. Stanišić had effective control over anyone, even Mr. Simatović. In other words, they do not believe their own case. It is mere rhetoric, it's a strategy, and it's a strategy that has cost Mr. Stanišić dearly. Take Arkan. Not a single piece of evidence suggests Mr. Stanišić met or even spoke to Arkan during the war. The evidence shows that in 1994, 40 of Arkan's men were used in Operation Pauk, and in 1995, for a few months, 7 out of a total of 400 received a per diem through the DB. Hardly the basis for a command case. In fact, hardly the basis for any case at all. No wonder the ever-willing Tunans tied himself up in knots when trying to help the prosecution case. As slide 2 shows, despite years of poring over documents, the best he can do in the end is suggest that Stanišić failed to fulfill his state security mandate and failed to neutralize Arkan's men. The same is true of almost every one of the alleged commands, from Martic to the Scorpions, to almost all of the Red Beret groups that mushroomed throughout Croatia and Bosnia throughout 1991 and 1995. The evidence is embarrassingly scant. Take Badger. There is no evidence that Stanišić commanded Badger or was formally or informally superior to him. According to the prosecution's pretrial brief, Milovanović, the VRS chief of staff, would testify that Badger considered Stanišić his boss. As slide 3 shows, this is simply not a fair appraisal of the evidence, nor is it a sensible inference to draw. Putting aside the fact that Badger, as the deputy minister of the Ministry of Interior of Serbia, was Stanisić's de jure superior, instead of evidence evincing a pattern of orders and obedience over years of action, the prosecution rely upon a confused observation arising from a single conversation. It is, and I use the word advisedly, astonishing that anyone could be prosecuted on that basis. An attempt to hold Mr. Stanišić responsible for the 30,000 public security men that were commanded by Badger. More allegations, more rhetoric, more strategy, more unfairness. 16 years of strategy, 16 years of fighting these extravagant allegations, 16 years of stress-related ill health and clinical depression, 16 years of waking up knowing that if the prosecution strategy succeeds, he will spend the rest of his life in prison. 16 years of his wife trying to keep friends and family together. 16 years of his 19-year-old son living with this case and fearing the worst. We therefore thank the Chamber for not only granting Mr. Stanisić's provisional release, even though he must still remain in Belgrade, but also for restraining the worst excesses of the prosecution's reinvestigation of the case. Mr. Stanišić is very grateful. Of course, the prosecution complained bitterly about each decision, but their determination to reinvestigate this case tells its own eloquent tale about their appreciation about their original case. However, do not expect them to admit it anytime soon, or in fact, make any concession about it whatsoever. More rhetoric, more strategy, more shifting of their case. As slide 4 shows, in the first trial, the prosecution case was that on the 4th of May 1991, Stanišić and Simatović identified 28 men at Golubic as being the most qualified to constitute the core group of the DB's unit. They, quote, mainly close quote, trained men at 26 training camps throughout Bosnia and Croatia, including 5,000 men who remained under Stanisić's command throughout the war. The prosecution's case was based on the Simatović's Kula Award speech, in which he boasted that the unit had been in command of 5,000 men engaged in battles with armed Croatian police forces in the RSK. The prosecution's 28 elite trainer case has now been surreptitiously abandoned. As argued in the first case, the prosecution in fact only ever named 22 of those men. And as we argued in that case, the evidence for 20 of the remaining 22 was hopelessly sparse. Indeed, consistent with the defense case, that Stanišić abandoned the nascent unit in spring of 1992, we showed 16 of those number were in fact dead or demonstrably not affiliated or in contact with Stanišić by the spring of 1992. As for the handful of others, which in reality is what this case is about, the evidence did not allow a reasonable inference that Stanišić had any link with them until they joined the JATD in 1993. So back to the drawing board for the prosecution in this retrial. Back to the drawing board and a silent shift in their case, instead of admission of the collapse of that case, vagaries, vagueness, and generalities. As slide 4 shows, instead of seeking to explain what the 28 did in detail, now what we have at in the prosecution's pretrial brief is a role for only 8 alleged members of the Red Berets: Subotić, Cerny, Dragan, Bozovic, Milkovic, Debeli, Mijovic, and Vuk. Gone are the 5,000 subordinates, Simatovic's demonstrably preposterous claim. Gone are the 26 training bases, cut and pasted from the speech and the walls of the Kula base. As we showed in trial 1, the prosecution failed to raise even a prima facie case of any DB involvement in 14 of the training camps mentioned in that speech, let alone any involvement of the first accused. Fast forward to the retrial, the prosecution has now shifted its focus to military operations. Having realized the evidence does not substantiate the case that the accused established an integrated network of covert training bases, the prosecution has now shifted its focus to a more limited number and the deployment of the unit into operations. What does this surreptitious shift tell us about the prosecution's case? Or rather, what does it tell us about the prosecution's approach to the case? As Your Honours know...
Mr. Jordash?
Sorry, Your Honour.
The interpreter's asking you to slow down, please.
I beg your pardon. Thank you. As Your Honours know, in order to reverse Mr. Stanisić's acquittal, the prosecution claimed that the appeals chamber of the ICTY could safely convict on the existing evidentiary record. We now know that this prosecution no longer holds that view. But it also tells us more. It tells us that the prosecution have yet to decide what the truth is in this case. In the first case, they asserted, quote, "The loss of the Milosevic judgment has left an inevitable void in terms of the historical record of the scope of the atrocities committed by Milosevic. The tribunal, we were told, is now faced with the opportunity to create a permanent historical record of these atrocities and bring justice to the victims of these heinous crimes," close quote. However, as their struggle to define the core of this case shows, the problem is not that Milosevic died. The problem is that the historical record they want to create is not based on evidence. The truth is that the truth they want to obtain, The truth they want is the one that works to obtain a JCE conviction that would enable them to convict Milosevic in his absence. That is what they are striving for, and it prevents them from running a reasonable case or otherwise making any concession whatsoever about the evidence. It encourages a myopia that is inimical to a fair appraisal of the evidence, justice, or the truth. Look no further than the JCE alleged in this case. The indictment lists the following Belgrade Serbs as alleged JCE members: Stanišić, Simatović, Milosevic, Kadijević, Adzic, Bogdanović, Badja, Kertes, Arkan, and Sešel. Despite 25 years of prosecutions, none have been convicted before the ICTY of the JCE alleged in this case or anything similar. Now, of course, some of them, Milosevic, Badja, and Arkan, died. But what about the others? Sešel was acquitted of participating in a joint criminal enterprise. Kadijević, Adzic, Bogdanović, Kertes, none indicted by their prosecutor, unlike Mr. Stanišić, all enjoying their retirement in Belgrade. In the face of this reality, in the face of their choices, the prosecution's case now neither looks like truth nor justice either. It looks more like a determined strategy, the objective of which is first to convict Milosevic through one single judgment, rather than the completion of a trial record over 25 years that reflects in detail the alleged concerted action and shared intent of the Belgrade Serbs with regard to the crimes of the Croatian and Bosnian Serbs. That determination forces them into an unrealistic perspective, based on distortions, not evidence. And we submit to your honours, as slide 5 shows, the case against Stanišić is thus based on 3 principal distortions that are designed to achieve this belated, de facto, anomalous conviction of Milosevic. Any conviction of Stanišić, we submit, for this joint criminal enterprise, or on this distorted basis, will not represent a convincing or credible addition to the ICTY's or the MICT's record. It will be, there is no doubt, an anomaly. And we submit one that will deny victims and affected communities today and into the future the truth they deserve. It is worthwhile examining these distortions. They are the first departure point for the defence case. Distortion 1. The Croatian Serbs shared a criminal intent with the Belgrade and Bosnian Serbs to forcibly deport non-Serbs from April of 1991. This is demonstrably false. First, obviously, this conflict is not about one JCE spanning 1991 to 1995 across Croatia and Bosnia. It is alleged that the joint criminal enterprise came into existence no later than April 1991 and continued in existence until at least the 31st of December 1995, with numerous individuals participating in it, including Croatian, Bosnian, and Belgrade Serbs. It is painted as a grand, amorphous, and unwavering enterprise capable of explaining all political and military action of all Serbs over 5 years of conflict, regardless of Croat or Muslim extremism or brutalization of Serbian victims. Second, no case at the ICTY has found a JCE beginning in April of 1991. Only August of 1991. Not Babbage, not Martic, none. The allegation in this case, in the light of that record, shows that the joint criminal enterprise pleaded in this case is pleaded for one purpose only: to paint the Croatian Serbs' clumsy self-defense measures, including the creation of the Golubic training base, as criminal, and thus implicate Milosevic and the Belgrade Serbs. It is particularly convenient in this case because, as they know, the evidence they have in relation to Stanisić's support to the Croatian Serbs is not only flimsy, but it dries up in August of 1991. Distortion 2. The Bosnian Serbs shared a criminal intent with the Belgrade and Croatian Serbs to forcibly deport non-Serbs from April of 1991. This again is demonstrably false. First, of course, the Bosnian Serbs JCE did not begin in April of 1991. The prosecution's own expert, Donia, testified that there was no shared common purpose in Bosnia to deport or forcibly transfer until at least March of 1992. Imagine running a joint criminal enterprise case where you want to indict the whole of the Belgrade Serbs, but to do so, you have to reject your own experts' evidence. Moreover, as slide 6 shows, if Milosevic ever adopted the Bosnian Serbs' strategic goals, which is highly doubtful, he rejected them wholesale in late 1992, early 1993. As Donia confirmed, Milosevic pressured the Bosnian Serbs to sign the Vance-Owen peace plan in late 1992 into 1993. And in doing so, he was expressly rejecting at least 3 of the 6 strategic goals, including the most important one. Number 1, the one that the prosecution claimed was pivotal to the ethnic cleansing. As Donia also confirmed, Milosevic merely held out the lure of the idea of unification between Serbia proper and the Bosnian Serbs and the Croatian Serbs. All initiatives came from the Croatian and Bosnian Serbs. Or, as Nielsen observed, see slide 7, from 1992, Milosevic thought that unification was a stupid idea. Quote, a story of unrequited love between Serbia on the one hand and the RSK and the RS on the other hand, close quote. It is thus not surprising that the most relevant Bosnian joint criminal enterprise cases, from Krajisnik to Karadzic to Mladic, have not found that Milosevic or any of the Belgrade Serbs, including Stanišić or Simatović, were part of any joint criminal enterprise with the Bosnian Serbs. As noted by the Karadzic trial chamber at paragraph 3460, quote, the diverging interest that emerged between the Bosnian Serb and Serbian leaderships during the conflict, and in particular, Milosevic's repeated criticism and disapproval of the policies and decisions made by Karadzic and the Bosnian Serb leadership, meant they could not be satisfied that Milosevic agreed with the common plan. Finally, distortion 3, which is unique to this trial, that the Red Berets existed from May of 1991 as a single unit operating within a military chain of command inside the state security's structural framework that was headed by Stanišić. Also demonstrably false. The evidence shows that there was a variety of groups, largely disorganized and untrained, and that there was no unified command. They were answerable to a range of persons, including, at times, individuals in the Serbian MUP and the Serbian DB. The real question for this trial that the prosecution seeks to obscure is not whether a single unit existed, but whether any of Stanisić's links to those direct perpetrators give rise to individual responsibility. If it is to be relied upon as a framework for an alleged criminal enterprise, a military unit can and must be defined in a criminal trial. The prosecution thesis should rest on evidence, an analysis of its structure, its functions, its membership and their roles, the chain of command, its object and purpose, and the manner in which these men are supplied, dispatched as a training or combat team, or coordinated with other military units during military operations. At a minimum, the evidence must establish consistency of command, consistency of membership, consistency of self-identification, consistency of identification by others, and consistency of function and purpose. Instead, from the outset, the prosecution's approach takes a different path. Instead of anything approaching this kind of detail, we are left with the prosecution's pretrial brief that provides a role for only 8 alleged members of the Red Berets: Ricky, Cerny, Dragan, Bozovic, Milkovic, Debeli, Mijovic, and Vuk. For everyone else, we're left with a list of names, with little or no indication of who they're supposed to be, what they're supposed to have done, how Stanišić is alleged to have interacted with them. At least in the first trial, we could track the claim that the 28 had been at the core. We could track what they'd done. Now the prosecution has retreated from that. What are we left with, other than the actions of 8 men and an ever-increasing list of men who apparently were in the unit? But it is a necessary strategy forced upon the prosecution through a paucity of evidence. If you build a case on a bunch of personnel files containing self-serving claims to be in a unit, but with little or no accompanying corroborative detail, this is where you end up. It is not a surprise. If you build a case on presumption, this is where you end up. If you ignore your own evidence, this is where you arrive. As slide 8 shows, the prosecution's thesis of a single unit rests on 4 principal originating planks. The second departure point for the defense is to show that these premises are completely misconceived. First, that there was a plan to create a unit that began in Golubic. Stanišić was in command of Dragan and Simatović, and they created an elite unit. The prosecution's evidence sits in contradistinction to this claim. At its highest, Babic, hardly a friend of either accused, confirmed that Simatović was, quote, a host, maybe supervisor, a senior person, close quote, at Golubic. RFJ 066 confirmed that it was only when Simatović left Knin in July that Captain Dragon's men came under Frankie's command and all started wearing red berets, close quote. Second erroneous premise, that the unit carried out operations in Croatia under the command of Simatović and Stanišić. He testified that Simatović only took command of the unit from August of 1991. Moreover, as the prosecution's own evidence shows, the Kninjas were only involved in two operations, one in Glina on the 26th and 27th of July 1991, and one in Lovinac on the 5th of August 1991. The evidence shows that Dragon, not Simatović, was in command. The third erroneous premise of the prosecution case, that the nascent unit commanded by Stanišić in October of 1991 was created to organize training camps in the Krajina and the SPWS and participated in military operations in Croatia, in the SPWS. As slide 9, not to be shown to the public, shows, RFJ 137 confirmed that Stanišić at the time made it clear the nascent unit was for use in Serbia and would be used for guarding facilities, securing important persons and foreign delegations, and would not participate in military operations. As the evidence shows, the nascent unit at Fruška Gora and Paisos conducted one military operation, an operation around Babska, and no more than the ad hoc training of two groups. One of them may have been Cerny and the men who went to Bosanski Samac. That is not the record of a group designed to create training camps throughout Croatia and to participate in military operations therein. As slide 10, not to be shown to the public, shows, there was a man in that nascent unit, one of the first recruits, a self-confessed extreme nationalist, who left the nascent unit because it was not going to fight the Croats or the Muslims. What does the prosecution say about that document? It's a personnel file. Nothing. But what could they say about that? Fourth erroneous premise, that despite a change of attribution, which is clear, from a Serbian MUP special unit to the RSK MUP unit in spring of 1992, nothing, in fact, concerning command or otherwise changed. However, we submit that the evidence from the prosecution's most compelling evidence, the various personnel files, supports the defense position that the nascent unit was disbanded by early March or spring of 1992. In particular, many of the men applied to be in the Serbian MUP unit at that time. Stanišić was involved. None of those applications were processed beyond a handful of operative checks. Moreover, as slide 11 and the defense case will show, Simatović, one of those tasked to create the JATD in 1993, was instructed by Stanišić to look into the Red Beret story. In 1994, he found evidence that is entirely consistent with Stanisić's case. The nascent unit fractured, leaving a small number to, quote, guard the Paisos and the Bella Chucha, White House, close quote, and the majority of the ex-members, quote, continued doing dirty jobs using the uniform and insignia of the Red Berets, close quote. As slide 12 shows, they fractured into at least 9 groups in Croatia with a range of command. What does the prosecution say about these 9? Deafening silence. The prosecution appears to have concluded that they have no responsibility to explain this evidence. They would rather allow you to conclude the worst. Now, none of this is to suggest.
Counsel, and I've been trying not to intervene in counsel's impassioned closing argument, which is really what we're hearing so far. This is all comment and, in our view, quite a bit of mischaracterization about the prosecution case, what it is and what it isn't. And I'm not going to intervene anymore, but I think that it's worth noting. We certainly would like for that to be noted. This is not a forward-looking statement of what the defense case is or can be expected to be. This is a closing statement, or it's at the very least a submission that could have been made at the 121 hearing. It's just for the record, Your Honor.
And before Mr. Jordash continues, I would remind him that this is not a jury trial.
Sure. Well, Your Honours, I don't accept the prosecution criticism. It's our opening. We can open it as we choose. And we open it by pointing out the prosecution's approach, first of all. We will then outline what the defence evidence is going to be. It's not a basis for objection that you disagree with the defence. As slide...
Apologies, just before he continues, we wanted to direct the chamber to a potential redaction issue at page 13, lines 14 to 15.
Sorry, what was that page and reference again, Mr. Stringer? I see it. I see it. Thank you. Yes, thank you. Please continue, Mr. Jordash.
Now, none of this is to suggest that some members of the Serbian MUP or DB did not maintain contact with some of the original members of the nascent unit and use them to loot and pillage. The evidence suggests that they may well have done. As the fracturing into the 9 groups show, it was not difficult to form small paramilitaries during this war. All that was needed was a sponsor from a state institution such as the JNA, the VRS, the MUP, or the DB, and a handful of ready and willing men. As clear as this was in Croatia, it became even clearer in Bosnia in 1992 and 1993. As the evidence shows, rather than one unit, many new Red Beret units sprung up, including those in Brčko in April and May of 1992, Zvornik in April of 1992, Boy in May of 1992, and Eastern Bosnia in 1993. The prosecution's approach to a vaguely drawn unit is designed to distract from the essential task at hand, to examine the links to ascertain who procured those units and for what purpose. The Krajisnik appeal judgment, citing both Brajinin and Martic, expounded upon the threshold links that must be established to prove a case of this nature. These include, quote, evidence that the joint criminal enterprise member explicitly or implicitly requested the non-JC member to commit such a crime, or instigated, ordered, encouraged, or otherwise availed himself of the non-joint criminal enterprise member to commit the crime. This may be shown where there is clear evidence that, quote, orders were passed from the political leadership to military officers, close quote, and the quote, leadership actively supervised the operations, close quote, which were undertaken on the basis of, quote, a plan of action broadly formulated by the political leadership, close quote. In other words, despite the prosecution's distraction, Your Honours must examine the links and the claim that orders were passed from Stanišić to the paramilitary commanders and that he actively supervised the operations that were undertaken on the basis of a plan of action. And so the defence case will show that even though some of the units were linked to individual members of the Serbian MUP or DB, most were not. They were often not acting in pursuance of a plan. In fact, they were most often not acting in pursuance of a plan or making a material contribution to the JNA or VRS operations. They were common variety looting squads seeking to enrich themselves or their immediate commanders. As the defence case will show, there is no evidence that Stanišić gave them orders, pursuant to a plan or otherwise. The proposition that the Chief of State Security, a man with obvious opportunities to enrich himself directly from the state coffers, if he had chosen, would stoop so low to create and command these criminals, not to assist the Croatian or the Bosnian Serbs, but to use the chaos of the war to pillage cars, fridges, TVs, and other household goods, does not make any sense. An examination of these links exposes the lie at the heart of the prosecution case and explains their determination to distract with a single unit proposition. A couple of examples will suffice. First, Dragan in Divic in May, June of 1992, and Cerny in Bosanski Samac in April of 1992. Each of these men, according to the prosecution, were critical members of the overarching unit. First, Captain Dragan and his Red Berets. Even Tunans, a valued member of the prosecution's military analysis team for much of the life of the ICTY, was forced to admit that there was no documentary evidence that, quote, established or that allowed to establish direct links or direct involvement of Mr. Stanišić in relation to the activities of Captain Dragan in the underlying period. But that is one issue. The other issue is perhaps more important. The evidence actually shows that whenever Dragan was based in a region, his arrival had not been anticipated by the local authorities, let alone arranged by the Serbian DB. As slide 13 shows, this was true of his pathetic camp in Divic. Instead of a well-paid DB-sponsored elite trainer, Dragan exploited the chaos and lack of functioning structures, including the police, and tried to subvert the local authorities. Ultimately, these men did nothing but play soldier and loaf around. At P2934, in P2934, page 4492 to 3, Milovanović, the prosecution witness, testified that he considered them to be renegade, thieving bastards. The defense case, therefore, will ask the question, where's the link to a bigger unit? Where is Stanisić's command? And just as importantly, where's the plan? So that is one end of the spectrum where there is really no evidence to suggest a Red Beret unit built by Dragon was part of any larger unit or plan. At the other end is Cerny and the events in Bosanski Samac, where there is at least some evidence of a link to Stanišić, even if it is unconvincing. The prosecution alleges at paragraph 95 and 166 of their pretrial brief that Stanišić, quote, deployed the unit under unit member Cerny to take over Bosanski Samac in April of 1992, close quote. There is at least some evidence suggesting that Stanišić was aware of Cerny and played some role in his going to Bosanski Samac, and Simatović played some role in their training at Paisos. As I say, not convincing evidence. However, an examination of the links between Stanišić, the men, what happened in Bosanski Samac, exposes the distortion that there was a single unit under Stanisić's command. First, this aspect of the prosecution case is advanced mainly through RFJ 035, who claims to have been trained under the supervision of Simatović, after which he became a member of Stanisić's Red Beret unit. However, an examination of his personnel files showed that in 1992, he signed a statement saying that, quote, since we left for Bosnia, I served as a special purpose unit member of the MUP Krajina. This contemporaneous claim to belong to other units is corroborated by all the other relevant combat reports. None of these alleged Red Beret units claimed at the time to be in Stanisić's alleged unit. Radanović was a platoon commander in the SRS, according to him. Debeli was the chief of staff of the Posavina Brigade, without reference to any association with the Serbian DB. In military proceedings on the 25th of November 1992, Milković described himself as being part of a group of radicals to come to assist the soldiers in Posavina. Milković also stated that he was a member of the Radical Party in Kragujevac. He said he had been trained by DB members, but did not claim to be in a DB unit. He stated that for a certain time, as a volunteer on the battlefield, he received a salary from the MUP of Serbia. More saliently, he stated that the relationship between his volunteer unit and the Serbian MUP ended when a conflict broke out between Radanović and Cerny about command and control. Quote, since then, the group has acted as the police of Republika Srpska, close quote. Slide 14, not to be shown to the public, comments on Cerny's return to Bosanski Samac in October of 1992. A military report sums up the local disappointment with his return. He promised the VRS he would bring 700 volunteers with him. Instead, he brought only 20, quote, some of whom had never seen a battlefield, close quote. They were all loafers. The loafers came from Kragujevac. Instead, he tried to steal the best men from other units in order to form a shock unit. So the defense case will ask the question, where's the link to a bigger unit? Where's Cerny's Red Beret unit under Stanisić's command? And where's the plan? So this is the second departure point for the defense case. We urge the trial chamber to examine with utmost care the prosecution's alleged unit. It is nothing more than a Trojan horse designed to persuade you that there is no need to examine the facts or the detail. It takes the misconduct of a handful of so-called Red Beret men and seeks to build a link to Stanišić through the imagined infrastructure of a unit. Of course, even if Stanišić was in command of a unit through 1991 to 1995, it ought to go without saying that this does not obviate the necessity to examine every link, every action, every crime, and if you can find any, every command. Moving now to the second part, the defense case, and what we will present in terms of evidence. We will rely upon evidence from 21 witnesses. 19 will testify live in court. We will rely upon a volume exhibits, many of them from the prosecution's own list, which we submit will do what the prosecution case fails to do, which is to contextualize and explain essential issues. It will focus on 5 main issues, or 5 main areas. We will deal with these chronologically as best we can. As outlined in slide 15, they are as follows. First part of the defense, Stanišić and the DB, designed to secure Serbia, not wage war in the Republic. Second, the emergence of conflict in Krajina and Golubic as a defensive endeavour. Third part of the defence, the role of the DB operatives in the conflict, particularly in SBWS. 4, the creation of the JATD in 1993, Stanisić's first anti-terrorist unit. And 5, we will deal with the events in 1993 to 1995 and Stanisić's involvement in security and humanitarian operations. So the first part, Stanišić and the DB designed to secure Serbia, not wage war in the republics. The first part of the defence will include, or will involve, a focus on Stanišić and the DB. The theme of this aspect of the defence, summed up eloquently by the prosecution witness RFJ 130, who, when asked whether Stanišić had run a training camp in Korenica, with barely concealed derision answered, quote, "Why would the Chief of State Security run a training centre? It would be like a minister appointed to act as a chef in the kitchen," close quote. So the first part of the defence case will explain some basic facts about Mr. Stanisić's character and the State Security Service. We will call evidence to show that the DB was neither required nor equipped to carry out the role alleged. Mr. Stanišić was an apolitical professional leading an organ within the Serbian MUP that was and had to be non-discriminatory. Our first witness, RJS-1, if permitted to testify, will confirm his valuable role. Sorry, I should have said our once anticipated first witness, if permitted to testify, will confirm his valuable role within the international community. In the intoxicating days of nationalism and ethnic hatred, Stanišić alone extended the hand of friendship and moderation to the world community to use what leverage he had to help solve the crisis. When all around were losing their heads, he alone in Belgrade stood as the man the international community could do business with. It is noteworthy that he was the only leading official in Serbia without a travel ban. Over 100 others were banned from traveling outside of Yugoslavia's boundaries. As our first raft of DB professional witnesses will show, Stanišić was a professional civil servant who strove to ensure legality. He fought to ensure that the DB did not become an organ of Milosevic's SPS party, only a protector of the state and the people. Uniquely, he refused to join Milosevic's party and insisted on the same for all the DB staff. The mandate of the DB was to collect data and information with the purpose to detect and prevent activities aimed at undermining and overthrowing the constitutional order and endangering the security of the country. As each of the first witnesses, RJS-2, RJS-3, and RJS-4 will testify, fighting Serbian extremism in Serbia through Operation Thompson was much more essential than supporting the war. Hence, the attempt to set up a unit in 1991. The DB's experience in the 1990s, in many respects, foreshadowed current security concerns faced by Western countries like the UK and France, facing threats of mass killings on home soil from several hundred radicalized fighters returning from Syria and Iraq. Likewise, dozens of paramilitary groups emerged in the fray between 1991 and 1995, often linked to opposition groups in Parliament. There may have been as many as 80,000 armed men, many of whom were determined to seize power if the opportunity arose, including through the assassination of the president and Serb officials. Rather than prosecuting a war outside its borders, Stanisić's job was much more essential to Milosevic, to hold Serbia together and prevent civil war. No wonder Milosevic saw to it that Stanišić, a career state security professional, not one of his political stooges, was appointed to the task. Milosevic's survival depended upon it. The prosecution case cannot fully explain how a relatively small organ, said to be criminal and deeply involved in ethnic violence, spent a considerable amount of its resources fighting discrimination and protecting minorities from paramilitaries. The prosecution case cannot explain how Stanišić could be the man charged with securing Serbia through dismantling paramilitaries on home soil, but in command of the same extreme paramilitaries across the border in Croatia and Bosnia. It doesn't make any sense. This is not to claim that the DB was perfect, and that no one from the DB committed crime. That is not our case. It is plain that some members of the DB were involved in crime, and some were involved with paramilitaries. And we submit, and we will call evidence to show that he should be no more held responsible for their activity than the registrar of the MICT should be held responsible if I decide to violate Council's Code of Conduct. Slide 16 shows an exchange between the defence and Nielsen, the prosecution's MUP expert, in relation to evidence that Crnagorac, when detained by Davidovic in Brčko in 1990, had claimed that he had been sent by Frankie and Tepper and that they had lent them weapons, equipment and cars from the station. Commenting on Stanisić's role in relation to Crnagorac's group, Nielsen claimed, quote, that if Stanišić had nothing to do with this, or the DB as an institution had nothing to do with this, that would mean only one of two things. Either that Mr. Topalčević and Simatović were acting on a solo basis and illegally, or that Mr. Stanišić was incredibly negligent in the performance of his duties as the chief of the DB. Our first witnesses will explain that it was not possible for Stanišić to micromanage every supply of weapons or ammunition, every employment decision, every engagement of operatives, associates, or reserve forces, or their per diem payments. As such, the defence will show that the prosecution case represents a profound mischaracterization of the DB's structure as a secretive civilian organization, staffed by professionals whose mission could only be fulfilled by trusting professionals to exercise and act upon their own judgment. These witnesses will show that the prosecution's attempt to portray the DB as, or compare it with, a military hierarchy where the demands of military operations require the issuing of orders and mechanical obedience to them, fundamentally misunderstands the difference in mission and modus operandi between the two. The second part of the defence, the emergence of conflict in Croatia and Golubic as a defensive endeavour. As noted earlier, the prosecution's narrative of the conflict is demonstrably flawed. Not a single piece of evidence suggests that Golubic, operating between April and July of 1991, was set up for any offensive or criminal purpose. That thesis is designed for one purpose only, to blame Milosevic and now Stanišić for assisting the Croatian Serbs between April and August of 1991. As the defence case will show, however Matić and Babić and other criminals acted later on, the Croatian Serbs from 1990 had cogent, objective reasons to fear for their safety. Tudjman and his government were fascists. They believed that the Serbs should be expelled, baptized, killed, which is pretty much what happened in 1995. The defence will lead evidence through RJS 5, RJS 6, and RJS 7, all of whom were engaged in significant political positions and roles in the Krajina at material times. They will confirm that the Croatian political and military extremism represented an existential threat to the minority ethnic Serb community in the Krajina. as RJS-05, a Croat, will confirm, scores of Serb villages came under attack from Croat special forces, Croatian MUP, and/or the ZNG. Serb villagers lost their lives, and many, many more were forced to flee their homes. Instead of modern weapons, the locals were armed with hunting rifles or outdated weapons from World War II. In the early days, the SDS supervised this ad hoc and defensive supply. Some crisis staff made their own arrangements, but there were some coordinated defensive efforts for villages under threat. As the evidence will show, this is a long way from a coordinated supply of weapons designed to facilitate offensive operations sponsored by the Serbian state. Significantly, prior to August 1991, as the evidence will show, the JNA across Croatia was attempting to prevent an escalation of the violence on both sides. Time and time again, it acted as a buffer to separate the villages and the ad hoc militia. The prosecution case is silent about this. They are attempting to establish their alleged joint criminal enterprise commenced in April of 1991 in order to ensure that Simatovic's actions in Golubic and any support that Stanišić is alleged to have provided to the Croatian Serbs can be viewed as contributions to a criminal purpose. Of course, for that, they need more than a collection of clumsy defensive actions by poorly armed villagers or newly created police. They need the JNA and other alleged JCE members from Belgrade to have acted in concert in furtherance of crime. As the defense evidence will show, this perspective is untenable. The defense witnesses will confirm how, in April of 1991, a range of defensive steps were taken locally, including the decision to open Golubic in April of 1991, not to train paramilitaries, but to ensure that the local police had the ability to defend the villages that were subject to raids by militia and marauding gangs. Ad hoc assistance from Belgrade was forthcoming, including by way of weapons for those trainees in Golubic, and including from Bogdanović, the then Minister of Interior, Topalčević, member of the DB, and retired JNA generals. Despite the prominence that Golubic plays in the prosecution case, it only operated for 3 months and trained only 200 to 300 men.
Časni sude, ja se izvinjavam uvaženom kolegi, ali zbog gospodina Simatovića nije bilo u jednom trenutku prevoda. Se obezbedi prevod na BCS. Da.
I take it that the interpreters heard that intervention by Mr. And they will be corrected. I trust that this was not a prolonged period, that there was no interpretation.
Ne, časni sude u redu je, ja sam samo zbog optuženog zamolio da dobijemo prevod. Inače ne, vrlo kratko i sve u redu. Hvala.
Thank you.
Despite the prominence that this camp plays in the prosecution case, it only operated for 3 months and trained only 200 to 300 men. Despite some basic military-style infantry training, the focus was on producing police officers, not combatants or special forces. Every single witness in this case speaks of the Croatian of Golubic as a defensive project, as will our witnesses in the second phase of our defence. As slide 17 shows, and as the defence evidence will corroborate, the proposition that Captain Dragon's Kaninjas were special forces would be laughable if it was not so tragic. Only weeks before the training began, Captain Dragon telephoned his friend and requested a manual for basic infantry training. Aside from the attempt to collectivize responsibility, the prosecution case is offensive because it seeks to paint a history that effectively demonizes one side and rides roughshod over the brutality committed against the Croatian Serbs and their right to self-defense. As the defense will show, the fact that the likes of Babic and Martic went on to commit crimes must not be allowed to obscure these essential facts. Of course, a victim is a victim on whichever side of the fence he or she might live. Meanwhile, as the defense case will show, while all of this violence and chaos was unfolding in the Krajina, Stanišić was defending against another type of attack in Belgrade by his own minister, Bogdanović, and the chief of service, Junačković. RJS-2, RJS-4, RJS-5, and RJS-15 will explain how Bogdanović and Junačković sought to remove Stanišić from the service through a treason commission that lasted at least between April and July of 1991. Despite the fact that the Belgrade Serbs were committing no crime in extending assistance to the Croatian Serbs, Junačković's actions ensured that Stanišić was unable to play any role. Even if the prosecution expert Nielsen claims that Stanišić was subject to the commission only until May of 1991, there can be little sensible dispute about its overall impact. As slide 15 shows, according to Curtis and intercepted conversations he was having with Karadzic, Stanišić was going crazy. His hands were tied. He couldn't do anything in June of 1991 because of his boss, Junačković. Junačković was an insurmountable obstacle. Why did Milosevic, given the prosecution case, do nothing to shield Stanišić from this treason commission? Why, if Milosevic saw Stanišić as his right-hand man, would he not shield him from this kind of political and professional attack? That is an enduring question that is unanswerable if you accept the prosecution case. The third part of the defence will look at the role of the DB operatives in general, but particularly in the SPWS in 1991 and 1992. The third part of the defence will focus on the prosecution claim that Stanišić embedded DB operatives Kojic, Kostic and Sarac into leading positions in the SPWS, quote, to exercise de facto control over these structures, close quote. As the defence case will show, that submission is little more than an attempt to distort the work of a professional state security service. Of course, Stanišić recruited DB operatives in the SPWS. Embedding operatives in foreign institutions is the bread and butter of intelligence gathering work. To suggest without more that this amounts to influence over that organization is to fundamentally misunderstand the nature of intelligence and counterintelligence work. The DB operatives, as Your Honours will hear, included Kojic, Kostic, Sarac, Lemic. They will explain that in light of the need for intelligence to secure Serbia, it would have been the height of irresponsibility not to have established and nourished those connections. To establish that these men were Stanisić's contribution to any criminal purpose, the prosecution must show that Stanišić instigated, ordered, encouraged, or otherwise availed himself of the non-JCE members to commit crimes in furtherance of the common purpose. This involves rebutting the obvious and wholly lawful explanation that these operatives were intelligence gatherers acting with the limited purpose of defending Serbia's national interest. The problem with the prosecution case on this issue is the one I identified at the outset. The prosecution alleges command of these DB operatives, but also command of the institutions in which they were working, in the TO, in the police, and the SPWS government. However, they are unable to point to any pattern of interference in the work of those managing these organs, let alone any kind of operative command. As the defense case will show, the truth is that the prosecution's struggle is to build a case against Stanišić in light of the roles which were clearly taken by others. Instead of accepting that the roles were taken by others, they seek to criminalize his intelligence function. As the evidence shows already, a range of rogues managed the territory and required no assistance from Stanišić. Kertész, the main coordinator from Belgrade. Badger, the head of the TO and the police. The JNA and Arkan managing the battle. As an aside, despite this array of actors, the prosecution alleged that Stanišić and other Belgrade JCE members arranged weekly weapons transfers for the SPWS and the SAO Krajina through the Association for Serbian Emigres. This is not a sensible allegation. As slide 19, not to be shown to the public, shows, Kertész, not Stanišić, was Belgrade's main coordinator of supplies to the SPWS. before the JNA came off the fence in August of 1991. After August of 1991, the JNA took over, including shipping in enough weapons and ammunition to raise Vukovar to the ground. Defense witnesses RJS 8, RJS 9, and RJS 10 will corroborate this testimony, confirming that DB operatives working in Croatia, including Kojic and Kostic, were gathering intelligence on behalf of the DB. Had Stanišić played the role alleged, some of the officials would have known. No witness can point to any of the DB operatives receiving a command from Stanišić or in any way acting within these institutions to affect his wishes. Once again, as with Arkan and the mushrooming red berets in SPWS, Stanišić appears to be commanding men in furtherance of crime, but nobody is noticing. Your Honours, I don't know if that's a convenient moment.
Very well, we would reconvene at 11:30.
All rise. Voyez-vous lever.